I look a little bit rougher than I normally would in a video. Today we're going to be working on the Yukata version of Bakugou Katsuki from Boku no Hero Academia. This costume is quite complicated, it's actually a fan design. I will add the details down below and I'll pop a little picture now. Here is the example of the design. The actual link to the account that made this is going to be in the drop down below, though this costume is based on that design and a little bit edited. So that's what we're going to be working on today. This is a commission, so it's not going to be worn by me, it's going to be worn by Honeydude Cosplay. I will also drop his stuff down in the bottom. So without further ado, let's go! So to start with, what we're going to do is cut out all of the fabric pieces for the actual base yukata. I'm using a pattern for this. I will have the pattern linked down below that I actually used, but I've slightly modified it just to extend the length of all the pieces because I actually want it to sit a little bit lower than the gi top in the pattern actually does sit. So it's just going to sit a little bit more like a yukata, so it sits at about like midway on the thigh. This is the orange strip that goes all around the edges of the yukata, and I'm cutting two pieces of this and I'm going to sew them both together later on so that we have one continuous giant long strip. Then we're going to cut out the front and back panels, and we're going to need two of them, so one for each side. And we're not going to be cutting any lining because none of these pieces actually need to be lined. The whole pattern is designed to not be lined. And I'm just cutting these out of a plain black fabric, whereas I chose to use a patterned orange fabric. I wanted a little bit more contrast. Then I'm just going to cut the sleeve, and the sleeve is massively extended, mainly because, as you'll see in the design, the sleeve hangs very low, and we actually want it to hang over his fingers a little bit. And I'm only going to cut one piece of the sleeve because the sleeve design actually only has one sleeve. It has like a drop gap on the other side. And then finally we're going to cut these little rectangle pieces, as you can see, and these are actually designed to be the wrap, so they actually hold the yukata back together when you've finished sewing it and constructing it. Then I'm going to fold over my long rectangle pieces so that they become thinner rectangle pieces, and iron them flat and then pin them all together. That way they'll start to look a little bit more like our actual structure that we want to build of our wrap. And then we're going to pin the back panels together along the back seam, so we have one big piece for our back panel. Then you're going to want to sew along the edges of the little black rectangles. Those, you just want to do an L shape along the edges, so you just want to sew one of the little ends all along the top of the long end, and then leave one of the little ends open. Then you want to sew all the way along the back panel piece, just so you've got that big seam running all the way down the back. You're going to want to turn the little long rectangles inside out so that you can't see any of the hems and they're all tucked up inside neatly. Before you do this, it might be helpful to just cut the hem edges a little bit so that they're as small as possible, so there's not too much bulk on the inside, and then iron them shut and flat. Then you're just going to sew along the edges of those to close them while folding in the ends of the open end so that you can't see any hems on the outside and it all looks really neat and professional. Then you're going to want to sew along both sides of the hem on the back seam. The best way to do this is to split it down the middle, iron it flat, sew both sides, and then to iron it again on top once it's all finished, and it gives it a really crisp, clean seam. Then you're going to pin on the little wrap straps that we made earlier. Those you're just going to have to follow the pattern for. It's going to sit about where the hip is on somebody wearing the yukata. You can do it by eye if you'd prefer, but I just found that easier. You just pin them into place. Don't sew them yet, and then pin the front panel on top of that back panel, shoulder to shoulder and side to side, and you're just going to pin the shoulder seam and down the side seam. You're going to leave that gap that is available for putting the sleeve in later. I sewed a little bit higher up on the side where he's actually missing his sleeve because that's a little bit more flattering and I didn't want his entire side to be out. So when you're pinning this, it will actually sandwich the little straps in between the two pieces. Then you're just going to sew along those edges and sew along every seam that you've done, so those top shoulder pieces and the 2 side pieces. And again, you'll repeat that pressing and hemming each seam like you did that back panel piece. Then you're going to want to fold your sleeve piece in half, and again the pattern will tell you which direction to fold it in, and you're going to make that long tube of fabric by pinning those 2 pieces together and pinned along the open seam. Then you're just going to sew that and hem it as well. And then I took the opportunity to put a roll hem into that sleeve end that isn't going to be attached to our yukata, so the actual place where your fingers will be. Now a rolled hem is exactly what it sounds like. You literally just roll the fabric over once and then roll it again so that the clean edge is the only thing that's visible and the frayed edge is going to be sandwiched in between the fabric. You can see me doing it here, and I iron it every time I do a fold just to keep those lines really crisp. And then you sew along that top part, so you want to sew the furthest inwards line. You just sew as close to the line as possible, and then you're just going to pin your sleeve into your shoulder of your yukata, sew along that edge. I would go really slowly on this and just ease the fabric into the correct place, and then I'm just going to hem that seam again. Then I'm going to roll hem the open sleeve section, so the sleeve that doesn't actually have a sleeve, and the bottom hem of the yukata, and I'm just doing, as I did before, a normal roll hem, but I'm actually going to sew the top furthest in bit and the bottom bit just to give it a really crisp clean edge. Then I'm just pinning the 2 pieces that I've got for the cuff together and sewing along that seam, hemming it exactly how I did all of the rest of the pieces, and then sewing it along the open edge, all along that edge, to ease it into place since it is a curve you are following. Now when finishing the cuff, what we're going to do is we're going to fold it out like we're hemming it, the previous way that we'd hemmed the back piece and all of the other pieces. Then we're going to press it a little bit, fold the excess that we've left at the bottom up so that we've got like a clean edge right there, pin that in place and double the orange fabric over, so we're folding it in half and tucking that edge underneath, so we're doing like a mini roll hem to tuck that edge underneath. It's quite hard to verbally explain, but that is essentially the technique. You're just folding a little edge and then folding it in half and tucking that seam. You have to be very careful here that where you're sewing, the orange is going to meet the orange, not a little bit of black, because you don't want to see that thread on top. And then you're just going to sew that all the way along, so along the bottom, all the way along that seam, and again stay as close to that edge as you can. And then you're going to sew up that furthest out edge just to finish that hem and give it a really clean edge. That's what we're going for with all of this, just those really crisp clean edges. And then we're just going to sew the ribbon onto the sleeve. His sleeve has a little bit of ribbon detailing, so I've just taken a matte orange ribbon, quite a thin one, and I'm just sewing that onto the sleeve edge. And again, I'm just sewing along one edge, tucking it underneath when I get to the end so we've got a clean bit finish, and then sewing the other edge. Right, so that's closing the yukata section of the costume. I hope you guys are going to like this video. It's just less like a tutorial, more like walking you through my process of working on costumes. So I hope you enjoy it, I hope you learn something maybe, or you just enjoy watching the video. It's a little bit of a long one, but the part 2 will be coming very soon. Thank you very much for watching, and as always, please remember to stay creepy.